Welcome, Life Sciences, to another exciting life science lesson. Today we're going to talk a lot about plants. And I know a lot of you, I know the kids in my class, they roll their eyes when they get to do plants. But plants are so awesome because you can go outside and you can see things and you can touch them and you can look at them. So it's actually a really hands-on part. Okay, so what we're going to look at, let me try and get it for you in a nutshell. We're looking at plant diversity. Now, when we're looking, we're not going to look particularly at specific plants. Well, we are going to in a way, but what we're going to look at is how plants have changed over time. So if we will use the word evolution, that would be one of our key terms here to see how plants have changed or evolved over time. Okay, so let's have a look at a few of our key concepts. Now, the one question that I've put over here is that plants, you might have done the section on microorganisms where we looked at the kingdom called protists. And protists had two little branches to them. And the one branch went to the animal kingdom and the other branch went to plant-like. And I use the word plant-like because they weren't plants. We called them algae. So what they could do was they could photosynthesize, but they didn't have the roots, the stems, the leaves, the kind of tissues and certain characteristics that we're going to have a look at when we're talking about plants. So what we're going to look at, what we're going to focus on now is we're moving from the water, where we looked at algae, and we're now going to look at how plants start to adapt to live on land. Okay? That's what plants do. They are terrestrial. Yes, some plants are able to live in water, but we're generally looking at the concept of moving from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial environment. When we look at our concept map over here, you're going to see these are what we're going to look at. And they're going to be some very big terms. If you have a look on the board here, you're going to see we're going to have a look at words that you might not recognize. For example, phylogenetic. These are all going to be new terms to you. And all these words over here, bryophyta, pteridophyta, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. Okay, what are we going to look at? We're going to take plants and we're going to put them into certain categories depending on certain criteria that we must use. Okay, so I'm not going to go through those keywords. You will see there are keywords on there as I go through the PowerPoint, as we go through the presentation. Then you're going to see I'm going to pop those keywords in. Then if you need to later, you can go through those keywords and just make sure you understand what they mean. Okay, let's have a look at the chart on the board here. Okay, guys, so we're looking at plants, right? This is what we're looking at. We're looking at the kingdom. Now, remember when we did microorganisms, we said that we looked at certain kingdoms, classification. Plants belong to the kingdom, all right, Plantae. Now, what we're going to look at is the following. We are going to look at 4 major groups of plants. Now, as you can see here, there might be words that you have not used before, and I use the word groups because that's exactly what they're going to be, right? So we're going to look at a specific group, and they belong to that specific group because they've got those specific categories, or they're missing something, or they have these kind of characteristics. And what I've done is I've put a picture underneath each of them of a plant, an example of a plant that we are going to look at in a little bit more detail to explain what do we mean about that characteristic. Okay, so the 4 groups of major plants that we are going to look at are as follows. We're going to look at bryophyte, okay, and there's a few plants that belong to that group, but we're going to pay particular attention to moss. If the season's very rainy, maybe you guys can go and check on your pavements or around your taps. You're going to find these, it almost looks like grass, but it's not. We're going to look at moss. They're going to be the most simplest plants. Then we're going to look at the next group. And as I said, we're going to look at the different criteria behind them. This group, it's like a silent P, is called Pteridophyta. And these pteridophytes, but there's lots of little groups that belong to it. But we're going to pay particular attention to ferns. And I want you to see if you're walking to school or if you're walking around in the veld or if you maybe have a garden, etc. I want to see if you can identify what these are. Our next group are called Gymnosperms. And gymnosperm basically means naked seed, and we're going to see why later that is called. But this belongs to the group that have cones. Right, can you see here? There's a few different kinds of plants, and we're going to just look at specifically at the pine tree. Then the last group of plants that we're going to look at is called Angiosperms. And Angiosperms are any plant that produces a flower. Okay, so we're taking our plant kingdom and we're going to divide it into the 4 groups. And we're going to look at the specifics of what is in that 4 groups. Now, when we look at plants, you need to understand that there's an evolution towards them. What do I mean by that? Some plants appear earlier in the evolutionary time scale, and over time, these different groups that I've showed to you appear at later stages. So if we look at these 4 groups, I could make this could almost be a timeline. So what do I mean by that? These would be your earlier plants, and these would be, right, your newest. So earlier or oldest and the newest plants. Now, when we look at the plant kingdom, what are we looking at? Okay, now I said to you we're going to take certain criteria and we're going to group the plants into that criteria. So what's the first thing we look at? The first thing we look at is plants, the common ancestor. What I meant by common ancestor is plants, they originated from algae, okay, from in the water, aquatic. And then plants, we saw later on that they were able to develop certain characteristics that enabled them to live on land. Now, have a look at this. What we're looking at is as follows. So we have this simple green algae, which is not a plant, it's a protist. But now, when we look at plants, when we start with the plant kingdom, we divide it into 2 categories. Now, there is the follows. Plants that have vascular tissue. Now, I don't know if you remember in maybe previous modules that you might have done, when you looked at plant tissue called xylem and phloem, and I don't know if you can remember, but they were long, thin structures. Xylem carried water up the stem. It looks like a straw. And phloem, generally, they had like these sieve plates. They carried food in a general direction down, right? This was phloem over here. Now, those tissues were like quite complex tissues. And when we come from the water onto land, xylem and phloem don't exist yet. So our first group of plants is very simple. They don't have any xylem or phloem. And this is the group that we start off with, the moss, the bryophyte. Now, because they can't have any xylem phloem, they can't get big, they can't transport water. Right, so when you go look for moss, it forms like a very tiny, small, right, because they can't transport water, so the water just puddles over them and they absorb the water by diffusion. They can't get nice and big, but they can grow on everything. Look here, it's growing on rock. That is important because when the earth developed, there wasn't soil, there was rock. And that moss, because it didn't have roots, can grow on anything. It grows on the rocks, and what does it do to the rocks? It breaks the rocks down by weathering, And when we break the rocks down, we get soil. And when I get soil, then I can, all right, bigger plants can then grow. You might have a look at it later on in the modules. You're going to look at something called ecological succession, but we're going to keep that for a long time. Okay, guys, so what we're looking at here, right, is we've got plants that had vascular tissue and plants that didn't, right? So because they had no vascular tissue, they belong to the bryophytes. Okay, that is moss. Now we go to the other side. Plants that have vascular tissue. Remember, we've got two choices here. Now, this group is now divided. So I've got these groups have got xylem and phloem. So they belong to a different group, but they do not make a seed. They make a spore. Now, a seed is quite a special thing, and that's only going to come a little bit later. So we're going to look at, all right, a plant that has xylem and phloem, so it can get bigger, right? The leaves can get bigger. It has stems. It has roots, right? But it's still, when it reproduces, it reproduces by a spore and not a seed. There's a difference between the two. There's a difference between a spore and there's a difference between a seed. Now, I want you to have a look. Maybe you've seen these, right, at the bottom of ferns on their leaf. Those are called sori, right? And what they've got in, they've got spores. And when those burst open, new fern plants, all right, are going to emerge from that. But they're still, all right, still vascular. They can grow quite big, but they're produced by spores. Okay, so we've got the vascular, okay, spore, seedless, and now seeds. Now let's have a look at this one. Now what happens if I produce a seed, right? So remember, it was vascular, but it was seedless. That was my fern, my pteridophyte. What do I call plants that produce seeds? Seeds are hardy, right? They got like this coat around them, and they can be protected, and they're much more resilient on land, all right? They're hardy on land than, all right, the spores are going to be. So let's have a look here. We've got two groups that fall into the seed bearing. One group is called Gymnosperms, and as I say to you, Gymnosperm means a naked seed. What do I mean by naked seed? I'm saying that the seed, and we're going to look at it just now, is found on the pine cone here. We're going to look at anything that produces a pine cone. Then the other group of seed-bearing plants are going to be these beautiful flowers. Now this over here is an apple blossom. It's a flower that is going to become, right, fruit. And some angiosperms, look at their seeds, nice and hard, find it in the apple over here, okay? And you're going to find that some of the angiosperms, they are going to be able to produce fruit. So their flower, right, and is going to become the fruit. They're going to attract the pollinators. It becomes a fruit inside there. And what's inside the fruit? The seeds, protected inside, rather than the naked seeds out on the cone that it might not be as safe. So what you're looking at, as we look at the plants over time, so we start to see how they adapt features that make them far more resilient, all right, or far more hardy to live on land, right? So to become less dependent on water. That's what we want to do. We don't want to dry out, but we don't want to be totally dependent on water. Okay, now it's a bit of a difficult term that we're going to look at. When we look at the plants in the 4 different groups, I'm going to just give you a general terminology what we use. Okay, so what we have is the following. When we look at the plants, we're going to find 2 generations. And what we mean by that is it's going to become a bit more clearer when we look at the plants themselves. But what it means is the following. Okay, when we look at the plants, we're going to see that there are, when we look at 2 generations, we're going to see that one generation, right, is called the Gametophyte generation. And what that means is this Gametophyte produces gametes. And a gamete is a sex cell, all right? And those 2 gametes, if I've got a male and a female, right, say I've got an egg and a sperm, if they fuse, the gametes fuse, all right, they make a sporophyte generation. And what does a sporophyte generation do? That is the generation that makes spores or seeds. Those seeds fall to the ground, and what do they give rise to? A gametophyte generation. The gametophyte has gametes, the gametes fuse, and we have a sporophyte. So it's this continuous cycle of what is the gametophyte of the plant and which is the sporophyte of the plant. All right, where does the emphasis lie? And for each of our plants, we're going to see which generation, all right, the gametophyte or the sporophyte, which of that generation is my dominant generation. Okay, which one? I won't say dominant as in plays a better role, but it's the more dominant of the structures that we are going to look at. Okay, guys, we're going to start off, before we have a break, looking at our moss plant. Okay, so when we look at moss, right, I've done a picture over here. You've got to have the picture in your head. I want you to understand, we looked earlier, moss can't grow very big. There's no vascular tissue. It's totally reliant on water. Now, if you can remember on your module when we looked at leaves, leaves have a cuticle, like a waxy substance over them, so that we can't lose water and we can't absorb water because we need to get it from the roots. Moss doesn't have that. A single layer of cells that water can just diffuse in. We're small, we've just basically, right, our common ancestors are from the water, so we can't go from water to wow, wham, bam, go to land. We've got to take things slowly, step slowly. So I'm very small. I need water, all right? I don't have a cuticle. The water comes in, all right, by diffusion. I don't have these roots or stems or leaves. I have stem-like structures or root-like structures, right? And when I get to the plant, my dominant generation is a gametophyte. Now I want you to have a look at the moss. This is the diagram that you'll need to be able to study and learn. Now if we look at moss over here, you'll see over here is a gametophyte, and a gametophyte means it produces gametes. And you won't believe it, but underneath the leaves here, there's a male leaf and there's a female leaf. And you know what? There's the female egg and there's the male sperm. And they need water. And when the water rushes over, the sperm swims to the female and they fuse. And when they fuse, right, they produce, this is N and N because they're haploid, they produce the stalk. Now have a look, it's not green. It's like almost like parasitic. And it's a seta, it's not a stem. And what it does is inside here, there's a capsule. And the capsule hangs and it's got teeth, right, like on the inside over here. So you've got something that's hanging and it's got like these teeth that cover. And when it gets slightly drier, when the environment is not as moist, those teeth dry out and they separate. And inside of here, what do you think is in here? Inside of here, we're going to find spores. Why are we going to find spores? Because this is the sporophyte of the plant. This is the only plant group that the gametophyte is the main generation. All our other ones we're going to see otherwise. So inside here, we're going to have spores, right, a process called meiosis occurs, which you will look at a much later stage, and these spores then fall to the ground. And when they fall to the ground, what are they going to do? They're going to make a new moss plant. So this is the gametophyte generation, and that is the sporophyte generation. Okay, now we're going to look at ferns. Now they are slightly one step up, so they're kind of like, I don't know if you've ever, and I think most of you might not know if you go and buy a car, all right? Sometimes you can buy a car and it's got nothing in it, all right? No electric windows, all right? No power steering, no ABS brakes, there's no radio, right? You can buy the basic car, and then you can add a feature onto it. So here, this is what we're basically doing. The moss is like your base model, right? That is it. It's as simple as you come. Now we say, okay, let's put, all right, electric windows into it. Okay, so now it's not the same as the base model. It's got something that just makes it a little bit easier. And that is what ferns have got. Ferns now have got xylem and they've got phloem. So what can I do? Xylem and phloem are able to transport water, so I can get quite big. And also because of that, I can have a cuticle on my leaves. I can have leaves. I actually have a stem. I have roots. Now, if you have a look here of this diagram, you can see this is its stem, and it's under the ground. And this is its roots. All the things that you see above the ground, that is the frond, what we call a leaf. Now I want you to have a look at something. I don't think you ever really see it because it disappears. When a fern is a baby, it consists of this little heart. It's tiny. It's called the gametophyte. And on the gametophyte is male and female. Okay, let me put the male on that side. And what do the male and the female do? There's the egg. And what does the sperm do? It swims, all right? And then they fuse. And when they fuse, guess what's going to start to grow out from the top? The leaves are going to start to grow, and the roots are going to start to grow. And as soon as that grows, you know what? That happens to this guy. He's tiny. He disappears. He shrivels up. There's the gametophyte. He shrivels up, and he dies. He dies. He's done his thing. Male and female, they've now fused, and what do we have? This beautiful whole plant is the sporophyte generation. And the sporophyte generation, all right, is the major generation. Now have a look. This guy can get quite big. Yes, he relies on water, right? He relies on water for the sperm to swim to the female underneath on the soil, but we're starting to see a plant that, although needs water, is not as reliant on water and can stay in places a little bit drier than our moss can. So it's got, what has it got? It's got vascular tissue, yes, but how does it reproduce? Have a look. What are these things that I said to you? These are called sori. And what does a sporophyte produce? Spores. And these spores are going to fall to the ground. And when they fall to the ground, what are they going to make? This little, it looks like a heart. That's why it's called a heart-shaped prothallus. But it's the gametophyte. And they're going to reproduce, and it's going to give rise to the sporophyte plant. Okay, guys, we're going to take a quick break. That was a lot to take in. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back, Life Sciences. I'm glad you're back. I hope you didn't get too scared about all those terminology. Remember, you've probably got a textbook or you might have access to a variety of resources. Go back, right? If you might have missed something, go back to this module, watch the video, look at your textbook, and just try and clear yourself up, right, on the different terms that we've used. Okay, so we're looking at the different groups that we put plants into, and it's all dependent on their different criteria. So we looked at a group called Bryophyta, which we looked at moss, and they were very small plants that didn't have any vascular tissue. Then we looked at plants that did have vascular tissue, but they had spores reproduce. And there we looked at, they were called Pteridophyta, and that's where we looked at the ferns. Now we're going to look at the next two groups, right? We're going to look at Gymnosperms and we're going to look at Angiosperms. Now guys, when we look at these two groups, right, both of them have seeds. So both of these are going to be the Gymnosperms. They're the one characterized by cones. Angiosperms are characterized by flowers. Now each of these no longer rely on water for fertilization. They pretty much adapted to a life on land, to terrestrial. And what they've done is they've produced this thing called a seed. Now what a seed is, it's different to a spore, is we've got inside our seed, what we've usually got is food. And then around the seed, we've got like a coat. So it's almost protected. We're on land, we don't want to dry out, so what have we got? We've got our own food, and we've got this nice coat around us, right, that protects us, stops us from drying out. And when conditions are good, that seed will germinate and will become a new plant. So both the Gymnosperms and the Angiosperms are going to produce a seed. Okay, now also both of these, like the fern, their sporophyte generation is going to be the major generation. So let's have a look. What do I mean by that? Okay, I want you to have a look at this. When I talk about the Gymnosperms and the Angiosperms, right, they are going to have a male sex cell, a gamete. And you guys know the term as pollen. So I want you to have a look over here. This diagram are male pine cones. And when the wind blows or you shake them, gives off all these tiny little things called pollen. And this is pollen. Underneath the microscope, pollen has a whole lot of different shapes. Okay? So here we've got the cone, and this is the male cone, and the male produces pollen. This is a flower. We're going to look at different models coming up. This is the male part of the flower, right? We're going to call it a stamen. Men, you see? The stamen. And this is the pollen, and there's the pollen, right? And what they're going to do is they're going to go onto the female. Now, a female, there's a variety of structures, but basically what happens, right, you are looking for a little egg. There's the egg. And this male is going to land on the female, and he's going to form, look at this, it's called a pollen tube. The guys have to do all the work here. I'm so sorry, that is your job. And he has to form a pollen tube to try and get his male sex cell into the female. Right? He's got to do the work. Doesn't use water. Doesn't use water like the fern and the moss. He's going to have a special cell called pollen, and he's going to land on a special structure of the female, and he's going to grow a pollen tube, and he's going to get to the female. Right? And when those two, when they fuse, what is the end result? They are going to make a seed. They are going to make a seed. Not a spore, all right, a seed. And that is a really important concept for you to understand. Okay, guys, look at Gymnosperms. We're going to look at the pine needle, the pine cone. Look at these nice, thin green leaves, but they're nice and thin. Why? To stop loss of water. The thinner the leaf, the less water I lose. Why? Because where do I live? I live on land, right? And I don't want to lose water. So my leaves are nice and they're thin, and I'm going to lose less water. What else I'm going to have? I'm going to have deep roots. And now I want you to have a look here. This, do you see this? This is the female, guys, not the male. There's the female. And look what is sitting naked. You see, that's why it's called a gymnosperm. There the seed is, lying open, or the female part, the female gamete. She's lying open. Here we go. She's lying open on the seed. And the pollen comes. All right, there we go. This is where she is. The pollen comes, and it joins with the female, and the cone closes. And then when it's ready, it opens up. Look here. It opens up, and look what falls out. The seed. See how nicely it's protected? Nice coat. This is a wing. Why is it a wing? What does the seed need to do? It needs to fly. Fly away. Go and find a new place. Fall to the ground. And what am I going to make? I'm going to make a new pine plant. Hey? A new pine tree. How's that for cool? All right, guys. Then my angiosperms. Those are my flowers, and we're going to look at that in a bit more detail when we look at the flower as a reproductive structure. Okay, now flowers, what do they have? Now have a look. You're going to learn a lot about this later on, but a flower, here is the female part of the plant, and what happens is the pollen comes and sits on her, and he grows a tube, and he fertilizes her. Now have a look at the shape. Round, round. What does the female become? The ovary of the flower becomes the fruit. Yes, guys, fruit is the female ovary. Most people go, gross, that's just disgusting. Right, but that's what it is. And what's inside the fruit? Very important, seeds. And those seeds are protected, right, by a nice seed coat. So what have we got when we get seeds? We've got gymnosperms and we've got angiosperms, and their seeds are nice and protected. Why? They don't dry out, and they are adapted to a terrestrial environment. They're much more comfortable on land. Okay, now guys, the last concept that we need to look here. This is quite a challenging one, and it's called the phylogenetic tree. Now, what a phylogenetic tree is, it shows us, I want you to have a look here, it shows us the evolutionary relationships. What do I mean by that? Basically, it shows me, remember I said about that base model? This could be time over here. And it shows me that this is my common ancestor. And each of these dots is where a particular characteristic, all right, develops. So let's, for example, over here, all right, what happens over there? I get vascular tissue. So all these tissues underneath here don't have any vascular. They are older. They are the older plants. And here, all of these, none of them have vascular tissue. Now what happens? What happens do I find? I produce vascular tissue. Now if I've got vascular tissue, ferns. Right. Now I have another evolutionary moment. I can produce a seed. So if a seed is produced here, it means that this group produce seeds and they produce. All right? They've got vascular tissue. They've got everything. So when we're looking at a phylogenetic tree, you're looking at the evolutionary relation. You're saying to yourself, okay, these are young. What have they got? They just got simple things. And then it branches out. Okay? They've still got the simple things, but now I've got an added feature. Okay, what are examples here? Then I've got this feature and that feature, and later on in time, another feature came to being. So ours was no vascular tissue, moss. Okay, simple. Vascular tissue, fern. Seeds. Gymnosperms, right? Flowers, angiosperms, right? So we're looking at basically what happened first. What was the feature that developed that made it more able for other plants to be able, right, without a better feature to be able to survive. Okay, guys, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to have a look at a few questions that we can ask you on this section. Welcome back, Life Sciences. I hope again you haven't run away, because as I said, these terms are really scary, lots of fights and all these phylogenetic trees. As I said to you, just go back, look at your notes, right, go back over the video and just relax and keep watching and seeing if you can understand the different concepts of the plants. Remember, we're looking at evolution, how the changes occurred over time. Okay, we're going to have a look at some of the possible questions we could ask you on the section. Let's see how well you do. Okay, guys, so the question here is, I've given you a diagram, and I'm hoping already that you are looking at it and you can see and identify it, and already in your head you understand where it's going to fit in. So I tell you that the diagram below is a non-seed, all right, so it's seedless, and it is a vascular plant. So it has got xylem and it's got phloem. Right. So those are concepts you need to, there we go, sorry. Those are concepts that you're going to need to understand. So what kind of questions can we ask you? There's some simple questions here that you need to know your work. So the first question is, to which plant group? Now remember, I said to you there were 4 different kinds of plant groups: the bryophyte, the pteridophyte, the gymnosperm, and the angiosperm. And this is a fern. This is the fern. So the plant group, you cannot say fern. That is an example, right? It wants you, and that's the long one. And if you say it phonetically, pteridophyte, that's fine. Don't worry about your pronunciation. Just worry about if you can say it phonetically. Say it how it sounds, and it's going to be much easier for you. So the plant group, right, not example of it, is the pteridophyte. Okay, the next question. What is the dominant generation? Now remember, you had 2 generations. Okay, what was my chances are? Gametophyte and the sporophyte. Those were your 2 generations. Now what do we know? The only plant group that had Gametophyte as its main generation was the moss. And this is not the moss. What is this? This is the fern. So what is the dominant generation? The sporophyte generation. So please make sure that you know that. The only plant group where the dominant generation is the Gametophyte was the moss. The rest of the groups, everything else that we did, the dominant generation is the sporophyte, the spore-producing, right, generation. Okay, now it says identify plant part labeled A. Now A is the stem, and it's called a rhizome because it is an underground stem. So part number A is called a rhizome. So the part number A, rhizome, because this would probably be the ground, and that is going to be underneath. Okay, now it says state 1 function. Guys, when it says 1, you give 1. You cannot give a list because your teacher, as soon as it says 1, your teacher is instructed, right, to mark the first one. Now, what is the function of a stem? Okay, so the stem, even though it's underground, what's it going to do? It's going to give or keep the plant sturdy. Keep the plant, I'm going to say, sturdy or upright, even though it is underneath the ground. Guys, what is it going to do? It's a base for the leaves. Right? What else does it do? What grows from the stem? Right, the roots. Roots grow from the stem, and what does it do? It anchors. It anchors the plant in the soil. Okay. So I've given you two here. So basically it's got to do with, right, anchorage, keeping it upright, keeping it sturdy. You don't want it to fall over. And underneath the ground, it's going to have soil on the top, right? And that's going to ensure that the leaves grow out of the top and the roots grow out of the bottom, and you've got this whole contraption that keeps everything anchored, right? It keeps it anchored in the soil, it keeps it sturdy, right? And it does its job of supporting the plant. Okay, now this is now you need to think. This can be quite a challenging question. The plant shown below can grow into a large plant. Yes, we can get very large plants. Name 3 features. What 3 things does this plant have that enables it, all right, look here, this plant to survive in a terrestrial life? Terrestrial means land. Now, what's the first thing that it can do? Number 1, what does it have? It has vascular tissue. If it has vascular tissue, what can it do? It can transport water. All right. And what else can vascular tissue do? Vascular tissue is strengthening tissue. So if it's strengthening and if it can transport water, what can it do? It can grow very large. So these two are actually 2 points alone. The vascular tissue alone allows it, all right, to grow tall because of the xylem and the phloem, right? And also xylem and phloem are made up of hard lignin. Don't know if you can remember when you might have done plant tissue, right? That's like dead tissue, and it's that dead tissue actually makes it grow tall, and the xylem and phloem can actually make it grow wider. Right, what else do I have? Now have a look here. I have got leaves. I've got big leaves, and what have the leaves got in it? The leaves have got a stem. Right, leaf stalk, if I may, if I use that. And what does that mean? It means again that the leaves are sturdy. They're strong. They're not going to flop all over the place. So they've got a steady, right, strong tissue attached to it that enables it to be nice and firm. Once again, supporting. So the stronger it is, the bigger the leaf can become. All right? And once again, it says here, into a large plant and the terrestrial. Now, what else do leaves have here? They have a cuticle. And what does that mean? That means that it doesn't, the loss of water, all right, is minimized. So because it has a cuticle, it's not going to lose a lot of water. Because it doesn't lose a lot of water, the plant can grow nice and big. And because it's got a cuticle, it can live on land, right? It can survive much better on land. Okay, that was that question, basically on the fern. The next question is that whole idea of a phylogenetic tree. Right, so here we've got, how do I know it's a phylogenetic tree? Right, what am I showing? I'm showing some kind of, all right, time here, and I'm showing, there's my, all right, my points, and now I'm going to have a look Here I can see my common ancestor and things that I've pointed out at the end. Okay, so guys, it says here, which group of plants is represented by non-vascular? Right, so the only group that is non-vascular, if you have a look here, this is my ancestral algae. So the non-vascular group would be the very oldest plant group. So if I look here, which one is the oldest? Because this is old and this is new, right? What branches are first? There we go, my Biodiversity. Okay, they're going to be the oldest. The next question, from the phylogenetic tree, which group of plants were the last to evolve? That means on my time scale, which are the newest? Okay, and the newest, they would be at the top of my line, and that is going to be my Angiosperms. The last to evolve, first, last. Right, and I think we're going to have to leave it to there because I know we're running out of time, and our last question, right, is how we're going to tabulate the differences between a bryophyte and an angiosperm. Draw up a table, see if you can do it. We've run out of time for the day. All right, guys, have a wonderful day. Thank you for tuning in. We're going to see you next time.